Holyrood Vote, we have been looking at some of the big issues that you told us could influence the outcome, what's important to you. We've already looked at the health service, the cost of living, and this morning we're tackling immigration. Now, technically, it has nothing to do with the Scottish Parliament. Those powers are reserved to Westminster. But a BBC poll released in the run-up to next Thursday's contest suggests that it is one of the top 3 priorities for voters. Well, Dr. Sarah Kyambi is the Director of Migration Policy Scotland. This is a think tank that assesses public attitudes towards migration and also advises on migration policy. Morning to you, Sarah. And alongside her, Mark Diffley, who is a pollster with Edinburgh-based Diffley Partnership. Hello to you too, Mark.
Good morning, Laura.
Good morning. Thank you to both of you. Sarah, maybe you could tell us first of all what the truth is about numbers, migration numbers. There's actually a really good page this morning on our website. BBC Verify have been looking at this and also asking the question, what impact do refugees have on housing in Glasgow? But what is the truth about migration in Scotland?
In terms of numbers, the statistics show us that after the Brexit transition period, there was a steep incline in net migration to a historic high in 2023 that sat around 900,000. But since then, we've also seen that in response to various route closures and restrictions, those have fallen off really very dramatically to sit I think it's the 2025 figures at around 200,000 net migration. So that's a really very substantial drop. And that shows us that there are parts of our system that relate to people coming to work, study, or join their family that are very much responsive to policy and legal changes.
But Sarah, has the picture been clouded somewhat by perception and by what people see in the irregular, what they would call irregular arrivals to this country?
Well, around asylum migration, certainly the small boats issue and concerns about asylum accommodation have been very visible, both in the media and in debate and in people's minds. And so that focuses people's minds on one aspect of the immigration system, where they do have concerns. But that tends to obscure quite a lot of other areas of migration where things have moved very much towards the kinds of levels of migration that we were seeing before the pandemic, certainly, and certainly on a downward trajectory, on a trajectory when numbers are going down. But when you look at people's attitudes, you actually see that the public's views are much more nuanced, and they do have an appreciation of the different types of views, different types of migration, I mean.
Well, let's talk a bit about those views with you, Mark. The BBC poll that we did suggested it was the 3rd most important issue, despite this, of course, being a reserved issue. It's reserved to Westminster. Does that track with other polling that you've looked at on public opinion on this issue?
Yes, it absolutely does. Your poll is in line with both our polling and others that are available. It is true that salience, we call it, so the importance to which voters attach to the issue has grown significantly in the last 5 years. So we started measuring this back in 2021, and at that point, about 5% of the population saw immigration as one of their top 3 concerns. That's now, in our polling, at about 25%. It was slightly higher in your poll, but you can see how it is sort of taken off as an issue. But I think there are a couple of points really to kind of point out here. One is that it's still a long way behind the other issues that you've covered on your programmes, a long way behind the NHS, a long way behind, particularly at the moment, the cost of living as an issue of importance. If you look at UK-wide polling, our concern about immigration is well behind concern in other parts of the UK. So the YouGov tracker UK-wide shows concern for immigration up at about 50%, so about double of what we find here. And actually, this is driven, our concern about immigration is driven entirely by rise in support for Reform UK and by Conservative voters. So if you ask SNP and Labour voters what their concerns are, immigration really doesn't appear hardly at all as an issue of importance. But for Reform UK supporters, about 75% of them say it's amongst their top 3 concerns. So you can see what's driving this. So it is true that concern for immigration has gone up, but I think it's important to put it in some context.
And Sarah, while it is a UK-wide issue in terms of visas, of the system, there are issues, there are ways in which it, of course, affects Scottish policy and Scottish public life when you're looking at services, for example.
Yes, and I mean, kind of in answering that question, I kind of reflect back on what Mark was saying. What we know in the literature is that as immigration numbers rise, political salience tends to rise with that. That's something that we see quite consistently in the literature. So again, I think possibly what we are seeing is concern rising as the numbers peaked and then starting to fall back down as numbers decline potentially. And again, like he said, that left-right split is very, very clear in the data. And so that shows us an explanation for the saliency, but also secondly, one of the things that immigration does is act as a proxy issue. It can often act as a proxy issue for wider discontents. And so often people kind of channel their discontent, whether that be about housing. We've seen recently that health outcomes are deteriorating, and that kind of, as people think about, why does my life feel more difficult? Why is it less good? That we seek explanations for that, and often immigrants are become a target for that. And in our politics recently, that has become something that is more pronounced in ways that are worrying.
Mark, just finally back to you. You touched upon this, but how much of a difference is there between people's attitudes towards migrants coming to work, as we've been hearing about the pressures on the care sector, for example, for skills gaps, and then the idea of asylum seekers or refugees who are requiring services that Scottish councils are having to run and pay for?
Yeah, so I think the truth is that our attitudes are actually quite complex and are actually quite nuanced. I heard your interview with the care home owner in Falkirk earlier, and with Donald McCaskill, and actually we are still the public is still very supportive of people coming to Scotland for skilled work visas, and even for seasonal and temporary work. We are much more likely to say that we support those, even though the attitudes have cooled slightly in the last few years. We are still much more likely to support than oppose that type of immigration. We're less likely to support family members joining others who are here, and certain types of asylum seeking. But broadly, we still see diversity as a positive for Scotland, and our attitudes have changed a bit, but we are still, I think, broadly welcoming and broadly supportive, and I think the data does actually back that up in quite significant ways.
Okay, Mark Diffley, thank you so much. Mark's with the Diffley Partnership in Edinburgh, and Dr. Sarah Kyambi is the Director of Migration Policy Scotland. And let me just point you again to that BBC Verify piece on our news website this morning. Phil Sim, Amy Stanton and Andrew Picken have written that, and it's just lots of really useful information there, lots of facts and figures around this issue.
And more on this with Graham Stewart at lunchtime and Fiona Stalker at drive time. They're continuing